Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie Pack, and I have with me today Rachel.
Hi,
Allen.
guys.
And just a disclaimer as we get into this podcast episode, these are our opinions. We do have some, I would say, professional experience that inform our decisions. And they're also our opinions. So if you love the concept or the book, The 5 Love Languages, we are going to talk about in this episode the problems with that book, with those concepts. And so if you want to remain a fan, maybe stop here, listen to a different episode. If you're curious, go ahead, keep listening, because we're going to get into it. The book, The 5 Love Languages, came out in 1992. There was a later edition that was updated somewhat in 2015. So depending on when you read these books, you might have read the first edition or you might have read the second edition. One of the main differences, in my opinion, between these two different books is that the 1992 version was pretty overtly sexist. And the 2015 version is more covertly still sexist, but it's more of the undertones, and you have to be aware of that because you might not pick up on that.
Yeah. It's softer.
It's softer.
It's softer sexism, but it is sexism.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a book written by Gary Chapman, who, let's just talk about him for a minute. He is a pastor. I do believe he is also a licensed mental health provider. But again, sometimes there is a distinction where you can get a pastoral counseling license, and that's different than a typical licensed mental health counseling. So I don't know if he's more of a pastoral counselor or if he actually has a mental health license. But he's also a pastor. And so most of the couples that he talks about in the book, most of the couples he's working with are in that vein. He's doing counseling as a pastor. He's working with those couples. He then is writing this book and talking about these concepts.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to recognize, and you and I have talked about this before, because he is a pastoral counselor in an evangelical Christian church, the frame in which he is working is very heteronormative. It's very stereotypical gender roles.
Yes.
There's a lot of perceived or maybe just assumed biases that come with that as he's working with these clients, because they are, and I will say this too, from his perspective it's been a while since I've actually read the book. I read it like once and realized it was not my jam.
Yeah, to be clear, we did not revisit the book or reread the book for this podcast.
Yes, we did not. There's a lot of, in general, right? In general, in pastoral counseling, the goal isn't necessarily to get the individuals healthy. It's to keep the coupleship together. That's the goal of most pastoral counseling. Because often, especially in evangelical Christian cultures, right, divorce is not an option. So whatever we can do to keep this couple together, we will.
Right. And that's clear, I think, in some of the examples. I did do some Google searches talking about, what the controversies, getting myself refreshed with some of the issues in the book. But I think the examples in the book, that's pretty clear that divorce is not an option, and the priority is to keep these relationships together. And I learned from experience from my own parents' marriage and eventual divorce that there are worse things than a divorce, namely staying married when you do not like each other.
Yeah.
And there is some serious dysfunction in the relationship. I would say staying married is worse than getting divorced.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, I don't know that divorce is the worst option in the world. And I do think that's not even put on the table for most of these couples who are going to pastoral counseling. So I can't speak for Gary Chapman in general. I know the culture. I know what's expected of that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of pushback if you start saying, well, maybe this relationship is unhealthy, or maybe we need bigger, better interventions.
Right.
And so also recognizing that. And I do think that Gary wrote this book probably out of a level of desperation, right? If that's the goal.
Mm-hmm.
In 92, we were watching a huge surge of divorce rate because no contest divorce had been passed in all 50 states at that
Right.
point. And
so the divorce rates obviously spiked because there were a lot of marriages that should have ended, but that wasn't a possibility because either it was hard to prove to the courts that you needed a divorce. You had to have specific reasons why.
mm-hmm.
And then also for a lot of women, they weren't able to have a credit card. They weren't able to have a bank account. They couldn't rent an apartment or a home without a male co-signing on that. And so those rights came about in the 70s
and 80s.
Yes.
Right.
And so those things had to happen before we could have no fault divorce.
Yeah.
And then when no fault divorce became legal in all 50 states, we saw this increase in divorce rates, and people were reacting like, oh no, we are seeing skyrocketing divorce rates. I don't know that they were skyrocketing, but obviously they were very high. However, prior to no fault divorce, I think the divorce rate was like 12%.
Yeah.
So you know that those marriages that ended in divorce must have been really bad.
Yeah. And so, so there's a level of this, and there was a little bit of panic in, I think, most like Judeo-Christian communities when no fault divorce passed because of the spiking divorce rate. And this was seen as a problem that needed to be fixed, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need to keep couples together.
Right.
So I think Gary wrote this as an answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Giving couples these concepts to help them have healthier marriages. And yet, in most of the examples he's given, you can see that these are very superficial fixes and not addressing the substantial issues that are actually going on in the marriage.
Yeah.
Or the attitudes of the different people in the marriage.
Right. So yeah, that's kind of the background. And since then, there's a lot of pop psychology. There's a lot of stuff that kind of swirls around the love languages.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I have talked about a lot of people who like the concepts of the love languages haven't actually read the book or
Right.
understand where Gary is coming from. But it has a lot of, like, it's a big deal. It grew pretty fast as a way to understand what love looks like, or how to communicate with your partner better, very specifically, in these very specific ways. And I mean, you and I want to talk about why that isn't as effective
Mm-hmm.
as Gary
Right.
would.
Well, and we decided
Present
to do this episode after that book, The 5 Love Languages, came up in staff meeting.
Yeah.
And we were having a discussion, and you and I were both like, that's not a research book. There's no real value that we can point to that comes out of that book. And we were talking on this, maybe not even into the depths, about why we don't recommend that book for couples we're working with, why we see it as a problematic resource. One of the therapists in staff meeting was like, oh, I really like this book. And another therapist in the staff meeting was like, wait a minute, this was required reading in my undergrad program. And she's like, why would that be required reading when it's this problematic? Good question.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a good exposure for people who are headed towards becoming licensed mental health professionals. This is not good exposure for them to learn how to do couples work.
Right. I also think you and I have akin it to Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. It very much takes on this idea that we're speaking a different language. We're just so unknowable
Mm-hmm.
as people.
To our heterosexual partner, right?
Yeah.
and that there are such significant biological differences between men and women. That is the problem going on in relationships.
Yeah.
And the research does not bear that out. The research really says there's really not that many differences. The differences do, chart different paths, but biologically we have a lot more in common than we do different.
Right. I mean, if you read things from the Gottmans, if you read things from Brene Brown, if you read things from Emily Nagoski, Sue Johnson, right? Like these like formative couples therapists, which Brene Brown is not, but she does a lot around emotions and shame and all of that. But if you just stick with the Gottmans, which have had a really, really successful rate of researching and understanding couples and what makes couples work.
And what makes couples not work.
Right.
They can predict, I think it's like 95%, maybe higher, whether a relationship is headed for what they call a disaster or a master, or this is a real healthy relationship and the two people have mastered the skills, or it's going to end in a divorce or a disaster.
Yeah. And these are people who have also spent decades researching couples and how couples actually work. And they would say there is a bigger range of differences within the gender than in opposing genders, right? Like there's a bigger range of differences among women than there is among women to men.
Right.
There's a bigger range of differences among men versus men to women. And so that's a myth that these books are founded on, that men and women are just unknowable to each other.
Like from different planets.
Yeah. And where I will say, and I haven't read Men Are from Mars, Women Are from Venus. That was another one like, this is probably not going to help me. I have other things to read. I do think that concept really, really does show up in this book.
Yeah, I would say Gary Chapman is operating from that similar perspective of men and women are very different. And so we need to teach them this language, which I often say we do have to learn an attachment language. And if that was not fluently spoken in your home growing up, then it is like learning a foreign language. But that's not a different language for men than it is for women. And learning an attachment language is, I think, different than learning a love language or understanding what your partner's love language is.
Right. So let's talk about the love languages. So we have physical touch or physical intimacy.
I think it's just physical touch.
Yeah.
Gift
giving,
words of service.
Acts of service, words of affirmation, and quality time. And those are the 5 ways that Gary breaks up love into different languages. And one of the things, I think one of our main arguments is that all of those things should be happening on some equal level if you love a person.
Right. Those are things that should be found, and research would say those things are found in healthy relationships.
Right.
All of them. Not just one, but all of them.
Right. So if we're like heavy-sided on one, but we're not, focused on the other 4, that's not a healthy relationship.
Right.
Because it's not showing up organically. And I also think that there's a level of this too, where love languages are not the language that we speak. The way that he talks about it is like, it's the language that our bodies speak. It's the language that our bodies understand love. I kind of look at it as like, this is the fruits of love. Right. If we are loving each other, if we're in a healthy relationship, if we're moving towards healthy, these are the seeds that get planted that create fruits.
Right.
But it's not.
And these are things that you will see in those relationships.
Yes.
But not necessarily trying to backfit them into the relationship.
Right. And that's the part that I think gets heavily missed in all of this. And I think, that's one of the things that gets heavily missed in all of this is the the fact that these are things, all 5 of these are things that we should want in a loving, healthy relationship. We should want to be physically close to our partner. We should want to be spending quality time with them.
Mhm.
We should want, we should be able to go to the grocery store and be like, oh, my partner really likes that chocolate, and just pick it up for them because we care about them. We should be able to hey, my partner's been sick for 2 days, so I'm going to get the house cleaned so that they don't have to stress about that. Those are,
or speak kindly to them,
or
let them know, what they're doing well, that we appreciate certain aspects of them. Those things should be just organically happening because of the nature of the relationship.
Right. I see you. I'm proud of you. I understand what's happening. I know you had a hard day, but you rocked it. Those are things that we do as supportive people if we're in a loving relationship.
Right.
And all of those should be present.
Yes. Yeah. One of the issues, I think, with the love languages that I have seen and also was talked about online is that, the way Gary Chapman is proposing these things in the book is saying, hey, you should know and be aware of your partner's love language and love them in that way. And a lot of times I think it gets reversed, in which people know their love language, and if their partner isn't doing things in their love language, they're like, that's not really my love language. I mean, thanks for the gift, but my love language is words of affirmation. Now that's how we weaponize the love languages.
Yes.
And I don't think that was his intention, to be clear, but I also think he didn't clarify that super well in either edition of the book.
Right. Yeah. And also, I think that there's a level of that where you should know your partner's love language and speak it to them so that they feel loved. And I know my love language and you're not speaking it, and therefore I'm weaponizing that against you. That is a massive amount of codependence and a massive amount of passive aggressive behavior that comes up from that. A lot of resentfulness, right? Because then we are hyper focused on this one thing that our partner is not doing versus the way that our partner is showing up.
Right. Last week in our men's group that you and I co-facilitate together, we were doing a trust equation.
Yeah.
And it breaks down the different aspects of trust. We ask him to choose somebody that they trust pretty well, and then somebody that they don't really trust. And then they are rating those people on a scale of 1 to 10 in different aspects, different areas. And when you get to the end of that exercise, really what comes out is now you have to look at you. We've been looking at these 2 people that you've picked and analyzing what works in the relationship and what doesn't work in the relationship when it comes to trust, and that there are different factors that build trust or don't build trust. But at the end, it's if you feel like the degree of risk in trusting anybody is very high, that's they're not going to be able to earn your trust, because you have decided, I don't really trust anybody, or I don't trust anybody past a certain point. And that's a you issue. That's not a they issue. And it leads to a good discussion, understanding that we also play a part in that. People can be trustworthy to a point, but if we have had bad experiences and we've decided we're never going to trust, then we're not going to trust.
Right. And yeah, I think that's true for these love languages, right?
Right.
If we have decided that this one thing, if you do this one thing to prove your love to me, then I will be okay.
Right. And he doesn't get into their backstory, what their experiences were prior to getting married, which we know that always plays, that always shows up in the relationship.
Absolutely.
And if they're not aware of that, that is going to play out in some disastrous ways.
Yeah.
But you don't know any background of either person.
And he might, and it might have been I'm trying to give Gary some grace here, but and that might have just not felt relevant or felt too wordy for the book. And okay, sure. But
that's missing a pretty big piece of working with couples.
Yes. And there's this huge vacuum, right? These couples are kind of created in a vacuum. And if you just talk about these love languages, then, or if you just talk the love language of your partner, then they're going to love you better. And then it's going to be fine.
Yeah.
Which again is this very codependent view of this.
Right.
One of the, right, like when you're looking at how, like the Gutmans talk about relationships versus how Gary talks about the love languages. The Gutmans really talk about like having boundaries, talking boundaries, like what happens when we get flooded, what happens when we get in a fight. And one of the things that they really focus on is like, we are often bringing these feelings and beliefs, these default settings from our life before the relationship into the relationship. So we have to readjust those in the relationship. Gary never addresses that.
Right.
In the book. I want to say these books.
Expanded into love languages for kids, young love languages for teens. I think there's one specifically, love languages for men, love languages for God. There's a whole, like it has, blossomed into this whole array. Interestingly, there is not a specific love languages for women, which again, I think is a sign of the sexism that is present in the book. And they've sold over, as of 2023, they have sold over 250 million copies. So these are out there. Again, not everybody who buys a book reads a book. A lot of people have heard of these concepts that kind of ring true, but they haven't actually read the book or seen some of the problems with the book.
Yeah. So, right. So like there's this level, first of all, I think that the assumption that like the first love languages book was written for women to fix their marriage is outlined in the kids, teens, and men's. Right. Because again, in the 90s, that was really popular. One of my favorite movies is Fried Green Tomatoes. And the woman, Kathy Bates, who is the wife in the movie, she's going to all of these empowerment groups and how to fix your marriage and like how to be seductive. And she's doing all this
to try to fix
her marriage because there's just no connection. And there's this one scene in this movie where like she's put on a dress, she's done her makeup, she looks really nice. She has fried this man chicken. And I'm just telling you, if anybody treated my fried chicken like this man treats her fried chicken, I would be done.
Because it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. The whole presentation is a lot of work. And you can tell she's spent hours like working on this. She has candles on the table, flowers. It's really nice. He comes in, grabs his plate, sits down in front of the TV and starts watching a baseball game. And she's like, hey, come to the table. Hey, like, let's talk about the day. And he's like mindlessly eating this fried chicken. And I know it gets under my skin every time I watch the scene. But like, I think that movie does a great representation of what women in the 80s and early 90s were doing to try to engage men. And like, at one point he says, if these classes are not helping you, stop. And she was like, I'm doing these classes to help us and you don't seem to care.
Which even just that assumption that women could do something to fix a marriage.
Right.
Like just one person could fix the relational problems between two people is absurd, but was also somewhat of the narrative of like, yeah, women should be going, like, heaven forbid a man go to a how to improve your marriage class.
Right.
And so eventually she loses it because of course she does.
Yeah. She takes an axe to a wall.
Yeah.
And is like, yeah, I'm getting rid of this wall. It's ridiculous. Like, and he's like, what is happening? And she's like, I mean, it doesn't matter anyway. Right. Like, you just like, as long as you have your TV and your baseball, you're fine. So I'm just going to live my life. And really like the movie is more about her finding herself and like, and whatever. But like that whole concept of, and I think that this is why, and the Gottmans actually say this, I can't remember in which one that they say it, and it's in one of their books. It may be in The Science of Trust, that a lot of couples therapy fails because by the time one partner has agreed to go to the couples therapy, the other partner is done.
Right.
because the other partner has been begging and begging and begging and kind of like the canary in the mine, like, hey, there's something wrong. There's something wrong. There's something wrong.
And they've probably been doing a list of things to try to address that because this other person wouldn't go to therapy.
Right.
I mean, that's probably one that they suggested. And then when they're like, I'm done, the other person, usually the husband, is like, okay, let's go to therapy.
Yeah.
And so you get a couple in where, is he motivated? I don't really think so. But she's also almost on the way out. She's willing to do this one last thing.
Yeah.
But that's what you get sometimes in some of the couples that show up in our offices is they're about ready to be done. Or at least one person is. The other person finally decided to make some attempt when they announced that they were done.
Yeah. Which I do think that cusp, right, is where Gary is seeing some of these clients and he gives them a Band-Aid. He gives them something tangible to like work on this. Now, I don't know that makes any long-term change.
Right.
Because you've just put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. But like, I think that was kind of the point of like stopping the bleeding as we can to keep this marriage together.
Well, and one of the examples he gives is this wife has been asking her spouse to paint this particular room, right? She's been asking him and asking him and asking him, and he hasn't done it. And so they're talking in Gary's office about this. And Gary says, well, maybe instead of talking about needing him to do this painting, you should tell him what a great person he is, using words of affirmation instead of asking him to do something, right? And a lot of men online were like, yeah, if my wife stopped nagging me to paint a room, I would think, oh, good, she changed her mind. She doesn't care anymore. If she stopped and was just saying nice things to me, I would not go paint the room. That's not what would motivate me to go paint the room. And they would say, like, I'm not saying that's okay. I'm just saying that's how men think. If she's not asking him to do it, he's probably like, oh, good, she's done with that idea. And again, just that idea that, you know, and you and I talk about this with some of our clients where we will say, okay, you have bought this investment, you've bought this house, and it is not only her job to take care of this investment.
Right.
You are a homeowner as well. And it is up to both of you to care for this investment and not just let it go to shambles, to try to, you know, have a space in which you like living. And that's not just her job, or that's not just a woman thing. It should be both.
Right.
Both.
Well, and that's that. I'm like, again, we come back to if you're in an equal partnership, that's some of the fun of it, right? Like figuring out what you want, figuring out the color, doing the task together, which is, you know, when we did the trust exercise, right? Like, can you collaborate? Can you do things together? And I mean, the other point of that, and if I remember correctly, right, in the book, in that example, she's also taking care of the kids. She's doing all kinds, like she just needs this done and she doesn't have time to do it because she's doing all of the other things. And he's not.
Right.
And so
it's not like she's not capable of painting a room. She's just busy and doesn't want kids in the room while she's trying to paint a room.
Yeah. And so she's asking for a partnership. Like, hey, if I tackle the kids, can you paint the room, or can we trade off so that we can get this done?
Right.
Because when I'm here by myself with the 4 and the 2-year-old, I cannot paint a room.
Right.
Because that's just
without having paint all over the house.
That's just asking for disaster. Yeah. Right. And so I think that there's just a level of like, like I don't think that is a line for line. If you are asking me to do something and then you start talking to me really nice, then I'm going to do that thing.
Right.
But also just the idea that her asking consistently and him not doing it, or because it sounds like he's also agreed to do it and then just hasn't, right? Which is a level of integrity,
right?
That like you're not following through with your own word.
Versus just telling her yes to get her off your back.
Yes. And so, right, there are just in that one example, there are so many things that as a therapist, I would be asking a lot more questions.
Right.
But Gary just says, talk nicer to him. Give him words of affirmation.
Right. Tell him how much you love him and what a great person he is. Okay, what about the room?
Yeah.
That needs painting. Like, what about that?
I love you. I think you're a great person. Can you please paint that room this weekend?
Yeah. So a lot of the examples that he gives, even still in the 2015 version of the book, are similar like that. Like, a woman's complaining about something her spouse is not doing. And he's kind of like, well, maybe you're missing that. Like, this is their love language. And if you approached it this way, and it kind of misses the point. The other one that I found really egregious is there's a wife that's complaining, her husband loves baseball, not just watching it, but he plays it. Probably a city league, something like that. It is not, to be clear, he's not a professional baseball player. This is not something he does for a living. And so on the day their child was born, he had to go, like shortly after the birth of their son, I believe it was, he had to go play a baseball game. And she's mad about this. And it says in the example, the son is now 15 years old. And then her mom had recently passed away. I don't think they give a time frame in the book of when that had happened, but her mother had passed away. And again, her husband was not there for her because, again, baseball games. He had to go to baseball games. And so she's talking about these two major life milestones for her that he simply wasn't there because he was prioritizing baseball. And the husband in this example, according to Gary, says, well, to be clear, when I went to baseball after our son was born, I was so excited. And I told everybody on the team, and I kept talking about how excited I was about this baby being born, as if that's some compensation for not staying with your wife who just birthed your son. And Gary's approach was, see, he's saying these things, and you're not giving him credit for that. Well, A, did she know that? Like, who knows if she even knew that?
Right.
But B, why would she feel great about the fact that he's telling all these other people and not being there for her?
Right.
In these critical moments.
Which, even by Gary's own theory, right? Quality time.
Right.
Around major events are one of the love languages. So even by Gary's definition, husband should have leaned into quality time and spending time with wife during these big major events.
I think all that Gary said to the wife is like, wow, you've held a grudge for a really long time.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, also, yeah.
She may have let it go, but then when her mom died, it resurfaced.
And also this idea of grudges, the reality is he missed two major life events. And like, okay, he was there for the birth, but there's a lot that goes into the next, like, I don't know, year.
I was going to say year after birth.
After birth. But really, like, I can't imagine being left at the hospital alone with my baby for you to go play baseball.
Right.
That feels dismissive of something. I mean, like
kind of missed the point.
Yeah, really missed the point. Like, birth is not easy. Birthing a child is not easy. Being a child who has gone through birth, not easy, right? Like, and
it's also a moment in which, I think both have the opportunity to recognize how life-altering this occasion is.
Right.
And what the husband is also saying to her is, it's not going to change my life. I'm still going to play baseball.
Right.
But it's going to alter your life forever.
Right. Right. Like, we make no contingencies for this new human that was born. You will, but I won't.
Right.
And again, like, that goes against everything you and I talk about as therapists, is like, that creates attachment wounds. There's so much there that just, and she felt it, right? She felt it. She knew it. She knew the weight of that.
And I would say this, if I was seeing this couple and the husband's like, yeah, and she hasn't forgiven me, I would probably say, why should she?
Right. You haven't changed
and I would
anything.
say, what have you done anything to show her that's going to be different, that you get it, that you understand why she feels so hurt about this?
Right.
Because if you haven't done that, why should she forgive you?
Right.
She knows you're going to do it again.
Right. And she does, and you do.
Right.
In another major moment in her life. And so, yeah, I think that one is just like, again, one of these points where we're asking women to put away their emotions of being hurt.
Or to be putting away all of their feelings around the unbalanced load of mental labor, emotional labor that women still, we saw this again with lockdown during COVID.
Yeah.
Women are still expected to carry the bulk of that.
Yeah.
And men are not.
Right. And I mean, that's exhausting. And the reality is, right, culturally, women are starting to realize they don't have to. Which feeds into a lot of other things. And I don't want to rabbit trail because I can rabbit trail pretty hard on that one. But
different episode.
Yeah, we'll get there. But I do think just the dismissiveness that happens in that story of her holding a grudge. The reality is, I don't know that she's holding a grudge other than she's preparing herself. Right? Like, this is my life. This is my marriage. This is going to happen again.
Well, and she's accepting the reality of the situation she is in. Yeah, that may not be a good thing for the relationship, but she has to be real about who she's married to, the situation she's in, and whether or not she wants to continue being in that situation.
Right. Well, and I do want to talk about the other one where the wife comes in, he's really verbally abusive. The husband is verbally abusive. It sounds like there's some
degrading. I think Gary specifically mentions the wife reporting being very degrading. He kind of describes, I wouldn't say kind of, he describes emotional abuse, verbal abuse. We don't know that there's physical abuse happening. That doesn't come up in the example.
But by definition, there's a lot of domestic violence happening, right? It's not physical domestic violence, but it is emotional and mental and, it sounds like spiritual as well. And they're in this conversation and husband is complaining that she doesn't want to have sex with him.
Right.
And
his love language is physical touch.
And she actually says, I feel unsafe.
Right.
Like in the little vignette, she says, I don't feel safe having sex with him because he's cruel and demeaning and all these things. And Gary says, well, if you have sex with him more, maybe like all of these other things will get better because you're speaking.
Maybe he'll be nice to you.
Maybe he'll be nice to you. I think it's almost exactly what he says.
Again, he's like, this is his love language. And if you are speaking more into his love language, then maybe he'll feel more connected to you. And then this other stuff will decrease.
Yeah.
And to be clear for this person and for a lot of people, we'll talk about this more in a minute because I don't want to sidetrack you. But for a lot of people, they read physical touch as sex.
Yes. Right. Yeah, we definitely need to talk about that. But so there's this level of, you have just asked a woman who has told you she feels unsafe to engage in sex with an unsafe partner.
Right.
That should never happen.
And maybe then he'll be nice to her.
Yeah. That is the line of domestic violence that continues to get women hurt. Like, no, we start assessing safety. This is a huge issue. And I really do hope that some of these were like made up by Gary. I hope that this wasn't an actual person.
I think some of them are made up, maybe based on some truths,
Yeah.
but they all have this happy ending,
Right.
which you and I both know that's not how we get to these happily ever after relationships.
Right. But that is never okay. It is never okay.
I mean, that's marital rape.
Yeah, it is. It's marital rape. That is never okay. And so, and this is the danger you get into with love languages when you compartmentalize them to like, if you do this thing, right? It's also very transactional. Right. If you do this one thing, then maybe he'll be nice to you and give words of affirmation.
In this example, Gary's not saying to the husband, maybe if you talk nice to her and stop being degrading and demeaning to her, she might want to have sex with you.
Right.
He's not saying that. Like, that is not in the example. The example is what the wife can do so that the husband can be nicer to her.
Yeah. And I think that is one of the biggest problems with the love languages.
Mm-hmm.
We have compartmentalized love to these transactional things that will not equal love.
Mm-hmm.
It will not equal love. It will equal a transaction, just like
Right.
the grocery store.
Because in reality, there are things because of love that we go through in relationships.
Yes.
If our partner is going through a difficulty, we're impacted by that, and we're agreeing to be impacted by that by staying in the relationship, by loving this person, and vice versa, right?
Mhm.
And so again, the nature of relationships isn't that everything is good.
Right.
And that is the transactional piece. I'll do this if you do this, and we both mutually benefit. But that's not always happening in relationships.
Right.
And even in healthy relationships, we go through a lot together.
Right.
And that can make two people stronger. That can deepen their relationship in healthy ways.
Right. And we know after a baby or after a death, we tend to not be as physical with partners, but we do want to spend more quality time with them. And so there's places in which speaking a specific love language is just not possible where the relationship is at. But if we're recognizing we love each other and this is where we're at, and it's not always going to be this way, but this is where we're at, then we can build endurance. But if we do that, well, you know, she had a baby and we haven't had sex for 3 months, so I'm just not going to be nice to her. No, that's not how love works. That doesn't create love. That is transactional.
It also sends a really messed up message about sex that like, because I know when I was, you know, young, having kids, and sometimes I'd be out in the neighborhood talking to other moms while our kids were playing, different things like that. And some of them would say, oh yeah, sex, you got to have it so often so they're not an asshole. And I'm like, I don't think I said anything, but I was like, that is not a good way to approach sex. I'm going to be sexual with you so that you don't turn into a big jerk. I was like, okay, that's a problem that I didn't really want to know about my neighbors. Maybe I'll stop hanging out with them so much. So yeah, I think there's some really unhealthy messages about sex. And a lot of it comes down to men feeling entitled or getting the message that they're entitled to sex, especially if they're married.
Yeah, for sure. And this whole physical touch equals sex. I do not think that is what Gary Chapman was saying.
Right.
I do think that is exactly what has been translated to pop culture, right? Like that physical touch equals sex. It leaves out all of the like hand holding and platonic cuddling and like, you know, the rubbing your back and all of that just goes out the window. It is just intercourse.
Right.
And so,
or it's that physical touch that then leads to intercourse. And if it doesn't lead to intercourse, then what's the point of the physical affection?
Yeah. Which is a huge myth. It's a huge problem. And I don't know that, I think that people get hyper-focused on that. And you and I have talked about, if we get a sex addict in our office, the likelihood that they are going to say that their love language is physical touch and that their partner's is acts of service
or words of affirmation
is high.
Yep.
And I think that
almost 100%.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think I've had that switch once where his was like gift giving or something. I don't know.
He was lying.
Yeah. But yeah, in the years that they have come in and mentioned the love languages to me, it is usually always that.
Well, and there's often, before you go too far, there's often a standoff.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to give her this until she gives me this.
Yes.
And now we're in this standoff.
Right.
Who blinks first?
Right. And right, again, love is being used as a weapon, which is not the point of this.
Yeah.
But love itself doesn't do that, right? Like love itself finds a way through that.
Like I remember we had been married about 3 years. Our oldest child was like 6 months old, and my husband's father unexpectedly passed away. And he was the parent my husband was the closest to. And it was really hard on him. I think his dad was 54 when he died, very young. I'm 54. And it was a good year where he was just not functional. And he was getting home late from work. And I knew he was going to the cemetery after work. And he wasn't very talkative. He just wasn't very functional for a year. And so a lot of that burden of the house, all of that type of stuff, the kids, fell to me. And I would say to him, how are you doing? Do you want to talk? He just couldn't. Like, it was just, he was inaccessible. And again, you go through that with them. I'm not expecting him to, give me words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service. He's grieving. And I'm trying to be a fair witness to that process for him while he's also not talking about it. Eventually he would talk more about it. And I think he's still got issues today that he hasn't unpacked from all of that. But even now, some things will come up and he'll start talking about that. And again, that happens in relationships. And we can't put a time limit. Like, I've been doing this for 3 months. Where are you? He just wasn't, he wasn't able to. And sometimes you have to get that. You have to know, like, yeah, I get it. You're not able to do that right now because this event happened.
Yeah. So, I think that's the point that's missed in this book. I also think that there's a level, and this has been true in every time I've tested it, but usually the love language that people identify as their primary is the place where they have attachment wounds. Right.
And this is where, in staff meeting for the listeners, this is where a couple therapists got emotional as Rachel drops this truth bomb because they weren't expecting it. And, one of our therapists was saying, like, I can't remember what her love language was. Let's say it was words of affirmation. And she's like, I know that one really resonates with me when somebody does that for me. So, like, I've kind of thought it was true. And then you say, well, I think oftentimes the love language that we identify the most with is usually where the deepest wounds are. And she gets really teary, she's trying to hold it back. I checked on her later. She's like, I've got therapy later today. I'm going to be fine. I'll just talk about it in therapy. I'm like, okay. But yeah, I think it does show up because there is a wound there.
Yeah. And, that we didn't experience a lot of, or was unsafe, or non-consistent. And so it does feel warm. It does feel fuzzy, but it's not sustaining, right? Like, that's not going to sustain us, but it is something that we've missed. And so we crave it.
And I've had male clients who will say, well, obviously I wasn't needing sex as a young kid. So if my love language is physical touch, how does that translate? And I'm like, I think, at least for a lot of our male sex addict clients, possibly our female sex and love addict clients too, the nurturing that should be happening, the attunement that should be happening in childhood translates for them into sex as adults. And so that would be how they're trying to get attunement, how they're trying to get nurturing and feeling that attachment, which that shouldn't really translate that way. We should be able to get nurturing and in a lot of different ways as adults.
Yeah. And so I think that that's probably the biggest thing that I think Gary misses in the love languages is that if you're identifying a primary love language, there are wounds there.
Yeah.
That you're going to have to heal.
And your partner can be part of that healing process with you.
But that's a deeper conversation than this is my love language.
And that's a deeper awareness that both individuals have to have about their wounds and their relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's our take on the love languages. is that I think there's a lot more, a lot of times there's more wounds that we can identify when our clients are talking to us about their love language. If there's any benefit to clients coming in and talking about the love language, that might be one of them.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't give us the most information, and we can get that information through other means in talking with them. But it can be helpful to help them identify how they're approaching relationships, why this is such a big deal to them, because it's actually this gaping wound that needs to be healed.
Yeah.
And that they have a responsibility in healing that. And that, maybe if they're in a relationship, their partner can also assist in healing that. But that's not the partner's primary job.
Yeah.
Or they can't do that more than the individual.
Right. And again, we come back to like attachment wounds, codependency needs, right? Like if we can like create some interdependence and talk about like, this feels safe here. It didn't feel safe as a child, or I didn't know that it could feel like this or look like this. Those are deeper conversations and deeper wounds that maybe we can, if we start with love languages as the framework, it goes deeper, but I don't think that is the love languages work that Gary is tapping into. I don't think that he knows that. And I do have a lot of issues with the language of love is all of these things kind of encompassed in how we are showing up as a partner over time. And I mean, you and I talk about this all the time, like compartmentalization is not integrity. We cannot be an integrated human if we are compartmentalizing things, and that includes love. And so that's what this feels like to me. It's a very compartmentalized, black and white version of how to handle an emotion that we don't always know how to handle. And I do think that integration of like, okay, this is what love looks like as a whole, is way more important than the fragmenting it out and compartmentalizing it to get an immediate result.
Often when things are compartmentalized, there's some oversimplification that happens around issues, around whatever. And relationships are complex, and that's okay, because that's what allows them to have depth and richness and real levels of intimacy. And so to oversimplify that by compartmentalizing things, or to think that one way of your partner showing up is enough, that just doesn't resonate. And there is good information out there. There are a lot of good resources. Like we said, Brene Brown is a good resource for being aware individually. Emily Nagoski, sex educator, gives some good information about sex for women, and then her latest book, Come Together, for couples. Sue Johnson, emotionally focused therapy, really looks at how partners dance around the attachment issues and how they can do that better. The Gottmans, years of research, and really some concrete skills I feel like that the Gottmans offer. Here's how to have this relationship, and here's a script. And I usually tell people I'm working with, follow the script initially. And sometimes they'll say, well, that doesn't feel very genuine. And I'm like, but I need you to get the skill. And if you go off script, you're going to end up in the same trap that you guys keep ending up with. So follow the script. And usually they will report, it actually worked. It didn't feel fake. It didn't feel like, maybe it was kind of clunky and awkward because we're not used to talking this way, but it actually helped resolve the conflict or to understand each other, different things like that. So I really like their work too, that they're giving very specific skills. And then, once you can learn it and the essence of the skill, you don't have to follow the script.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think that, this Gottman seven
principles of highly effective couples or something like that. Yeah.
That's a great example of something that is not compartmentalized, not black and white. It is fairly simple. The things that they are teaching in that is very simple. It gets real messy in practice, which I think is why they keep it simple. But it is effective, and it does some of that deeper work that we're talking about, right? It's different than the compartmentalization of the 5 love languages that just says, speak your partner's love language and then you'll get the return that you want. They're really saying, no, you got to be a partnership, and it's going to be messy. But if you practice this, then you can understand the concepts of what it means to show up in a relationship. And it's really effective.
Yeah. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.